telemetry and video data. One of the most important aspects of the journey to the moon was the telemetry data. This is the automated communication process by which measurements and other data are collected at remote or inaccessible points and then transmitted to receiving equipment for monitoring. It was an essential part of the mission to the moon and would be of significant importance for future journeys into outer space. You may think that the telemetry is not something that concerns you, but if you are using a computer running Microsoft or Mac software, or using Google or some other search engine for your searches, which you most probably are, then you are daily involved in telemetry. These organizations collect telemetry data on what you do every second of the day, and there's little you can do about it. In the UK, and also in many other developed countries, when you drive around town or drive on a motorway, information on your movements is collected via your car registration number. This is telemetry, and again, there is little you can do about it. Even when you're walking along the street or go shopping, your movements are being recorded by a vast network of surveillance cameras. It is just a fact of modern life that we need to accept. It may surprise you to learn that the average person in the UK is caught on a camera more than 70 times per day, and for someone living in London, that can be over 300 times per day. Lost information. On 15th August 2006, the Sydney Morning Herald reported that NASA had lost the original telemetry tapes of the Apollo 11 moon landing, which also included perhaps the most legendary Small Step for Man, Giant Leap for Mankind footage. These original magnetic tapes, which recorded the iconic images of man's first footsteps on the moon, are missing, and scientists fear that there is danger of these tapes deteriorating into dust unless they are found quickly and converted into digital format. The skeptics are quick to coin the phrase, "one small mistake by NASA, one giant loss for mankind." In 2006, NASA said the search is on to find the boxes of the original, high-quality, slow-scan TV tapes. The tapes were stored in 2,612 large boxes, each box holding about 50 tapes. These lost boxes apparently held the telemetry data tapes and also contained the original TV footage of the other 5 moon landings. Estimates of the number of tapes vary between 130,000 to 140,000, of which about 13,000 of these tapes related to the Apollo missions. These were not small tapes, as in the main, they consisted of 14-inch diameter reels of mostly 1 and some 2-inch wide magnetic tape. The tape recorder reader consumed a whopping 120 inches of tape every second, an astonishing speed of almost 7 miles per hour. So we're not talking about losing a bunch of keys or the odd book, we're talking about losing 2,612 large boxes. The skeptics say that we are not simply looking for a few tapes, but the whole building. In fact, it is a pile of about 11,000 cubic feet. Is that hard to visualize? Well, a modern 3-bedroom house in the UK is about 7,500 cubic feet. It was quite a challenge to lose almost 2 3-bedroom houses, the skeptics would say, even by NASA standards. The flight director of the Apollo missions, Gene Kranz, acknowledges when interviewed by Aaron Rainin that the data tapes are indeed lost. Kranz further states that even if the tapes could be found, there is no machine that could read the tapes, as the only machines capable of reading these tapes was destroyed many years ago. The skeptics say that NASA is hell-bent on destroying everything related to the Apollo missions except the glory. Finally, NASA researchers concluded that the tapes containing the raw unprocessed Apollo 11 SST signals were erased and reused by NASA in the early 1980s, unbelievably due to a shortage of magnetic tapes at the time in NASA. It transpires that NASA's usage of the 1-inch magnetic tapes amounted to 60 per day in 1981, which far outstripped the quantity available at the time. What does NASA have to say about this? Well, not much, to be honest, if you read their statements on the matter. NASA initially stated that they do not consider the tapes to be lost, just mislaid, and the search is on, but shortly afterwards they admitted that the tapes were indeed lost. Well, not so much lost, but wiped clean and reused. This loss is confirmed in the final report from the NASA searchers. Is it any wonder why the skeptics find the story so utterly unconvincing? These recordings were some of the most significant documentation of man's greatest achievement to explore the universe beyond our Earth, and for them to be so careless guarding it is mystifying. The skeptics reason that NASA may have something to hide and didn't want these tapes to be scrutinized by modern methods of analysis. We shall never know the answer, the evidence seemingly is long gone. NASA not only carelessly loses tapes, but also photographs. In the period of 1966 to 67, NASA had the lunar orbiter taking many detailed photos of the moon in preparation for the Apollo missions, basically in order to identify suitable landing sites. Most of these photographs were also assumed lost. Luckily, some of these original photographs were found by a group of amateurs who extracted about 2,000 photographs from 1,500 old analog NASA data tapes. Suffice it is to say that NASA has not been the best custodian of this historical material. It is hard to reason why, with such a large budget, these important artifacts were not more zealously guarded. After all, these artifacts were similarly as important to the American historical record as the American Declaration of Independence, which thankfully they have still managed to keep intact for 250 years. Lost technology. NASA was not only haphazard in the custodianship of its data tapes and photographs, but also of its technical design documents and manufacturing capabilities. The billions of dollars that were invested in the NASA Apollo space project did produce some useful technological value benefit, not only for future space exploration projects, but also for industry in general. The Apollo missions were made possible by the creation of the massive Saturn V rocket, which provided the heavy lift necessary to get the astronauts all the way to the moon. You might consider that this was something worth keeping, given NASA's sole raison d'etre is to explore space. It may surprise you to learn that they didn't, and the methodology and plans required to build this rocket have been lost. It is not only the plans and the design documents that have gone missing, but also all of the factory tooling was also scrapped. NASA now again needs a heavy lift vehicle for its Orion program and is once again having to re-engineer what NASA already had 50 years ago. The new heavy lift rocket for the Orion project has been named the Space Launch System, SLS, I assume for the lack of a more inspiring name. There are 3 remaining Saturn V rockets in museums that could possibly be reverse engineered, but how much easier it would have been just to follow the original plans. If you are familiar with the IKEA furniture assembly plans, then you may doubt this. Now, when we say that NASA lost the ability to recreate the technology that they had for the Apollo missions, it doesn't of course mean that they could not have recreated it again, but that would be very much like reinventing the wheel. What it does mean is that NASA is not capable of even getting astronauts to the International Space Station without taking a Russian taxi at US $70 million per seat round trip. The excuse by NASA for this lack of housekeeping is that the Apollo project was spread out among thousands of subcontractors and that it was quite impossible to keep track of every document, but quite honestly, this is a tantalizing feeble excuse. You can be sure that Airbus Industries, which also has hundreds of contractors, keeps a very comprehensive set of documents in some central location, and certainly, at some point, NASA must also have had a complete set of documentation. The lunar rover, which was used on Apollo missions 15, 16, and 17, was built by Boeing, and again, you guessed it, the design plans have been destroyed. If taking care of important artifacts is the object, then NASA fails miserably. In 2015, a priceless prototype of the lunar rover was sold for scrap to a metal dealer in Alabama. This was one of the early prototypes for the lunar rover and therefore has great historical significance, but somehow it wasn't cared for and ended up in the Alabama scrap metal yard. There is even a photograph of the NASA Apollo director Wernher von Braun driving this very vehicle. We're not finished with the scrapyards just yet, we have more. In 1976, 10 years after the Apollo launch, the rope memory modules were sold as scrap metal. Someone with a keen eye spotted them in a scrap metal auction and saved them for posterity. The video that is now being showed shows the programs on the modules now being deciphered. There is a great interest in the computing industry to see how these programs worked. Some remnants of the Apollo guidance computers still exist and are being reassembled by a group of enthusiasts hoping for the 50th anniversary of the first moon landing in July 2019. Jimmy Locke, a private collector, bought 2 tons of assorted Apollo hardware from NASA, which included many parts of the AGC. Imagine that! Amazingly, NASA was selling Apollo hardware by the ton load. NASA is not only careless with valuable technology and historical artifacts, but also appears that they are lax in their own security. Surprisingly for such an organization, they do not encrypt the data of their laptops, and recently they have had two stolen, perhaps another sign that they were not quite on the ball. In October 2016, 47 years after the original moon landing, NASA finally produced a white paper on science data retention. This paper addressed which NASA science data should be retained indefinitely and the conditions under which certain data may and should be released. Talk about closing the gate after the horses went walkabout. Back to the moon? The history of scientific advancement and exploration is well documented, and once a goal is achieved, there is always a continuous path for onward development. Archimedes is said to have designed a screw system in the 3rd century BC, which was used to raise water from a lower to a higher level. It wasn't then forgotten, but was further developed and still in use today for irrigation projects and hydroelectric turbines all over the world. Galileo is accredited for producing the first practical telescope in 1609, but in fact, he merely improved on the device first invented by Dutchman Hans Lippershey the previous year. The telescope wasn't then forgotten, but was further developed through the centuries. The Wright brothers designed and constructed the first airplane. This wasn't forgotten, but within a few years, others were building better and more efficient models. British aviators John Alcock and Arthur Brown made the first non-stop transatlantic flight in June 1919, quickly followed by others to complete the same feat. Now we fly the Atlantic with the same excitement as we catch a local bus. American aviator Wiley Post was the first to fly around the Earth in 1933, and he wore a patch on one eye. Now flying around the Earth is commonplace. Christopher Columbus discovered a viable sailing route through the Caribbean and opened up a discovery of the Americas. Vasco da Gama discovered the route to India and China via the Cape of Good Hope at the tip of Africa, so bringing about the demise of the Silk Road. Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay were the first to climb the summit of Mount Everest in May 1953. Now, over 800 climbers each year reach the summit of Everest. I could go on and on about mentioning notable firsts, but the point I'm trying to make here is that once something is achieved, then history tells us it will be repeated until it is simplicity itself. So what happened to the moon? In 50 years, nobody from any nation has even attempted it again. At the time of the Apollo moon landings, the world believed that this was just the first step in finally exploring our universe. Humankind had reached the moon and returned safely, so now the heavens were opened. At least that was the feeling in the late 1960s. NASA had proved that it was feasible, in fact relatively easy. Now you can start with nothing, and in just 7.5 years you can be walking on the moon. Imagine what they could have done in the next 50 years with technology improving on a daily basis. Well, here we are half a century later, and all those dreams have come to nothing. Not only have we not achieved anything further, but we haven't even been back to the moon. Perhaps worst of all, we are now told that going back to the moon has suddenly become rather difficult and considerably more time-consuming. We did not go back to the moon, so what else did we not do in the past 50 years? It seems we just potted around in low Earth orbit with Skylab, the Hubble Space Telescope, and now the International Space Station. It seems the moon is getting farther and farther than ever. Well, it literally is, but only about 7 feet in an average lifetime. Conclusions. It seems to be an undeniable fact that much of the Apollo material, be it hardware or design materials, have been purposely shoddily destroyed, sold off, carelessly misplaced, or simply just lost. So why did NASA lose, destroy, or sell such a large part of the artifacts from the Apollo project? One would have thought that the artifacts from one of the greatest achievements of mankind would be sacrosanct, a national pride, but clearly not. It was, after all, one of man's greatest achievements to leave this earth for the first time and walk on another celestial body. For humans to be able to fashion materials here on Earth that would enable men to fly out into space would have been man's greatest adventure and mankind's greatest achievement. You may wish to be gullible like the rest of the pro-NASA fan club and put these losses or artifacts down to some slight carelessness on the part of NASA. But for me, the sheer epic scale of the destruction of artifacts is clearly a manifestly deliberate act. I can only imagine that NASA considered that some of these artifacts may have served as possible evidence to expose the deceit as time progressed and analytic techniques improved. I ask you to ponder whether it is imaginable that any delinquent organization would lose or destroy much of the evidence for such a major technological achievement. It is beyond reasonable comprehension and just adds more credence to the fact that NASA Apollo missions were faked. It may appear to some that NASA is attempting to destroy as much of the original evidence that could be used with modern analysis techniques to prove the fakery and expose the deceit. Curiously, it does not appear to cause our pro-NASA devotees any undue concern, as they do not seem to mention it, or they simply avoid the debate. There is no question that these losses of artifacts cannot be accidental. They are too numerous and important for them to have been merely the subject of perfunctory management. The destruction of evidence was a planned objective for NASA. There was an all too clear risk that some of this evidence might be used to prove the fakery. For example, the telemetry tapes that could have shown the precise route taken by the Apollo missions to minimize exposure in the Van Allen radiation belts. You will recall this debate in Chapter 5 when the pro-NASA group explained that they had taken some polar route when the original NASA documentation shows otherwise. The telemetry data would have answered this question, so it had to be lost. We have a direct comparison with what NASA achieved in the 1960s with rudimentary technology and what NASA is doing now. It took just 7 years and 4 months from President Kennedy's moon speech in May 1961 to the Apollo 11 crew supposedly landing on the moon in July 1969. Now we have NASA struggling since 2004, a good 15 years, and they do not expect to walk on the moon again until the late 2020s. So with modern technology, we're supposed to believe that it takes a good 20 years to reach the moon if they ever do? Whereas with the old technology, slide rules and all, it took just over 7 years. This surely must be absolute proof of the NASA fakery. The evidence is there, NASA did fake it all, or certainly a large part of the Apollo moon landings. In order to keep the deceit, they needed to ensure that no evidence to the contrary would be available. The real reason that NASA had never returned to the moon in the past 50 years is simple. They never went in the first place. Keeping the secret. What a terrible era in which idiots govern the blind. William Shakespeare, Julius Caesar. The NASA believers argue that there are 4 self-evident reasons which easily explain why the Apollo moon landings could not have been faked. They base their assertions on paradigms which do not stand up to serious scrutiny, as we will now discuss. The first is that too many people worked on the Apollo project for the fakery not to have been revealed in the last 50 years. NASA states that about 400,000 people were involved in the Apollo project and that it would be unlikely that no one would have revealed the secret. The second is that the Russians would surely have known that it was faked and would therefore have broadcast the fact to the whole world, given that they were in a prestigious space race with the Americans. Thirdly, the astronauts brought back kilograms of moon rocks which are attested by the scientific community to be genuinely from the moon. Fourthly, the astronauts left retroreflectors on the moon, and that these are being used by a well-respected scientific institution for laser ranging to the moon. At first reading, these all appear to be extremely persuasive arguments, and for many appear to have been convincing. We will examine these self-evident postulations in this chapter. What secret? It is a contention often made by the pro-NASA group that so many individuals worked on the Apollo project that it would have been impossible for the fakery not to have been exposed by some whistleblower in the past 50 years. You will see that this statement is repeated over and over again on the pro-NASA fan sites. It is a rather strange statement, as it implies that all of these people were informed about the fakery and were presumably asked not to tell anybody. This is a typical example selected randomly off an internet chat group. That NASA faked the landing and managed to keep the secret until this day, with literally thousands of people remaining silent and not one single person among that group coming out with a non-fiction, fact-based tell-all book that points to a hard, irrefutable facts that do not rely on circumstance, imagination, or supposition. They repeat this NASA well-known statement that 400,000 people scattered across 20,000 contracting companies were involved in bringing the Apollo project to fruition. In reality, the vast majority of these people were employed by contractors designing and building the components needed for the Apollo missions and would have little understanding of the overall project. But you would imagine that surely the operatives working within mission control sat facing those numerous screens of information from the telemetry would have well known. Well, not necessarily so, as it is entirely possible that they were too deceived by the fakery. The only evidence of the missions that they had was the telemetry being received and feeding the particular data stream for which they were responsible. They would have no idea where that telemetry was coming from or whether it was genuine or not. They had many times previously practiced this exercise using simulated data. When you are reviewing a screen full of numbers, there is no apparent difference between a simulation and the real thing. The simple fact is that they had no reason to question anything, let alone start thinking it was all a hoax. The idea that the moon landings could have been hoaxed is still a staggering thought to this day. So, in essence, keeping the secret could simply mean that there was no secret to keep. The only people that would know about the fakery would be the members of the clandestine CIA or maybe the DIA group, the astronauts, including backup crews and some CIA-DIA operatives infiltrating and working for NASA. One imagines the CIA-DIA people could be trusted, perhaps on pain of death. The astronauts could be expected to join the cover-up as they were for most part serving military officers under orders from their commanding officer, the President of the United States. There may have been a few exceptions, perhaps like Gus Grissom, who probably sadly died for attempting to reveal the truth about the Apollo project. In summary, the pro-NASA devotees are stretching naivety to imagine that NASA informed the 400,000 people that it was committing fakery, or that NASA was so inept in their management of the fakery that the secret leaked out. It is no longer a valid excuse, as it purposefully misinterprets the real situation. It had no merit or substance whatsoever and is based solely on mischievous and ill-conceived misunderstanding of the facts. It has been used mainly by the pro-NASA group as an excuse to avoid facing the real issue of the actual fakery. And the Russians? The pro-NASA group will also tell you that if it was fake, then the Russians would have known and they would have eagerly told the world. After all, they were the main protagonists in this story, and you would imagine that they would have much to gain by exposing the fakery. Again, I have selected a random quote from the same internet chat group. Russia was our main rival and would have loved to embarrass us if we tried to fool people. Remember, there were 6 missions, so why would the United States risk getting caught that many times? That makes no sense. It is not all that obvious that the Russians did know. Even if the Russians suspected that the moon landings were faked, then they would need to furnish some solid proof. Announcing that it was fake to the world without incontestable proof would be seen as just a case of sour grapes. Suspecting is one thing, but proving that you are right with hard evidence is altogether a different task. There is also some evidence that the Russians' claims of superiority in the space race were also in part faked, and equally it could have been stated that the USA knew that it had equally exposed the Russians. On 12 April 1961, it was reported that the Vostok 3 Ka-3 spacecraft with cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin on board was launched from the Baikonur Cosmodrome. Yuri Gagarin thus supposedly became both the first human to travel in space and the first to orbit the Earth. However, there are doubts about whether Gagarin was actually the first man in space. There may be more to the Russian fakery than we first imagined. It is only after 30 years of secrecy that these facts have been revealed. It is interesting to note that Khrushchev ordered the Soviet rocket designer Sergei Korolev to get a man into space at all costs. The communist philosophy was to hide its failures and only publicly celebrate its successes. This contrasted sharply with the American way of publicizing everything in advance and mostly allowing real-time coverage by the press and the public. So perhaps both sides were mainly interested in convincing their own populations rather than convincing each other. It was after all an arms race thinly disguised as a space race. The respective populations may not have warmed to an all-out arms race, but a space race carried with it an excitement and prestige of a nation. If the Russians didn't know it was fake, then why would they now reportedly be investigating that very fact? I think that we can safely conclude that the Russians' whistleblower argument has no merit in proving that the Apollo missions went to the moon. Moon rocks. The Apollo astronauts supposedly brought back 840 pounds or 382 kilograms of moon rocks and dust. These rocks have been distributed to many scientific institutions around the world who confirm that they are definitely rocks from the moon. Again, a typical response from the same internet chat group. 2 words, moon rocks. They are rocks from the moon. And scientists agree they are rocks from the moon. Explain those away for us. So we are faced with the opinion of many trained geologists from all over the world that the Apollo samples are definitely moon rocks. My first problem with this is that how do they know that they are from the moon given that they have never been to the moon? I mean that they have nothing for comparison, or have they? Well, it seems they have. The Earth is already strewn with pieces of moon rock which traveled here as meteorites. Estimates from the mass of the material that falls to the Earth each year range from 22,000 to 78,000 tons. Most are in the form of dust particles, but a small proportion are rocks from the moon. So, many meteorites found here on the Earth do come from the moon. In this case, they are more properly called lunites. They are broken pieces of moon dislodged by other stray rocks from outer space impacting into the moon's surface. If they are flung high enough from the impact, then they can be captured by Earth's gravity and slowly pulled to Earth. Well, it could take up to 10,000 years for them to get here as they circle around and around the Earth, slowly being pulled closer by Earth's gravity. It is estimated that more than 1% of meteorites found on Earth are from the moon, so they are a reasonably scarce commodity and hard to find. If we want to find lunar meteorites on Earth, where should we go hunting? Well, basically anywhere on Earth, but no lunar meteorite has yet to be found in North America, South America, or in Europe. They undoubtedly exist, but the probability of finding a lunar meteorite in a temperate environment is incredibly low. Many experienced meteorite collectors have been looking, but none have yet succeeded. It seems the best places to find lunar meteorites are in arid deserts which have little organic growth to hide them. One such arid desert is the Antarctica, and the best time is summer as the ice melts, the dark rocks become visible lying on the surface. You may be surprised that Antarctica is classed as an arid desert, but the truth is it very rarely rains or snows in Antarctica. The average annual rainfall is just 2 inches. So what is the difference between moon rocks on the moon and lunites found here on Earth? First of all, any moon rocks passing through the Earth's atmosphere would have a burnt crust. Secondly, the rock when on the moon would have been bombarded by micrometeorites and will have the telltale zap craters, tiny holes where the micrometeorites had penetrated. So, in theory, it would be possible to artificially change the lunites to remove evidence of the entry through the Earth's atmosphere. So first we need to find some lunites. In the Antarctic local summer from 1966 to 1967, Wernher von Braun, the chief architect at NASA, participated in a U.S. government expedition to Antarctica. This expedition was one of the first to systematically research the ice surface of Antarctica for meteorites believed to have originated from the moon. The U.S. government claimed that the samples were for later use as a reference material to compare against the future Apollo specimens. The U.S. government claimed that the samples were for later use as a reference material to compare against the future Apollo specimens. The lunites collected on the NASA expedition to Antarctica could have been faked to resemble moon rocks on the moon by removing the rock's burnt crust and adding false zapped craters using lasers. As the geologists have never seen moon rocks and were unlikely to do so in the future, then these fake moon rocks would surface to convince geologists given that NASA state they found them on the moon. In conclusion, this moon rocks evidence is certainly not convincing, and it is more likely that the Apollo moon rocks were faked from Earth-lying lunites. Retroreflectors. The laser reflectors that the astronauts placed on the moon are a piece of equipment that enables laser light to be reflected and are technically referred to as retroreflectors. These retroreflectors are made up of tiny reflecting prisms similar to those that you see on road signs and on the rear of bicycles. These prism retroreflectors will always reflect an incoming light beam back in the same direction that it originally came from. It is said by NASA the retroreflectors can be used for experiments to measure the distance of the moon from the Earth by recording the length of time it takes for the laser signal to be returned. Remember, it takes about 1.3 seconds for the light from the Earth to reach the Moon. It may surprise, and perhaps if you are of a nervous disposition, slightly worry you, that we are slowly losing the Moon as it constantly moves further from the Earth by about 1.5 inches per year, about the same distance as your fingernails grow each year. This just means that the future moon holiday you were planning may get marginally more expensive than you had originally budgeted for. The retroreflectors placed on the moon's surface by the astronauts are claimed by the NASA Apollo believers as the absolute, explicit, conclusive proof that man did go to the moon and deposit the laser reflectors there. If it can be shown that the only way a laser fired at the moon could return a signal would be that a laser retroreflector must have been placed on the moon, then this would be a very important piece of evidence. I mentioned in the foreword that my definitive proof that I used to try to convince my children that man had landed on the moon was these retroreflectors. It was my stock answer that for me was irrefutable proof that Apollo 11, 14, and 15 astronauts must have been on the moon to place them there. I seem to recall that several independent scientific institutions and universities around the world were using it to calculate the distance to the ever-drifting moon. In fact, it was probably the worst proof that I could have chosen, as we will discover in the next portion to this video.